In just 1 year, 2015, there were over 52,000 deaths in the United States from this largely self-inflicted cause. In Seattle alone, there were 360 deaths from drug overdoses, most of them from one source. To make matters worse, many of the deaths came at the end of a doctor's prescription pad. Yes, there is a crisis in the United States, the largest drug problem in history, with over 250,000 deaths attributed to opioids. Dr. Andrew Saxon and Dr. Richard Reese are taking on that crisis one person at a time.
There are actually three different types of opioids. There are the opioids that occur naturally in the opium poppy, which humans have known about for thousands of years and used for their medicinal purposes for thousands of years. And there are about 20 different molecular compounds in there, but the main ones that have an effect on humans are codeine and morphine, that they occur naturally in nature. Then there are a whole host of similar chemicals that humans have produced in the laboratory, either by slightly modifying the compounds codeine and morphine that occur in the opium poppy, or by just synthesizing something brand new in the lab. Then finally, there are opioids that animals produce in their systems, including humans, the endogenous opioids. And the similarity between all of these three different opioids is that they all attach to opioid receptors, which are in the human brain and control a lot of important functions in our brain and our body.
So that being said, why is it a problem? It's natural.
It is natural, and just like with all psychoactive medicines and psychoactive drugs, we have natural channels in our brain that can be hijacked by external chemicals. And it's a problem because most of those drugs that cause dependence cause tolerance and dependence over time. Opioids are especially powerful and cause that kind of thing. And what happens when you use opioids over time is you get tolerant and dependent to dose 1, and then you end up on dose 2, get tolerant and dependent on dose 2, and then move to dose 3, etc. So you end up on a high dose of opioids, which then start controlling your life.
Well, they do many things in the brain and the body. Reducing pain awareness is one of those important things.
Wait a minute. You said reducing pain awareness. That means that the pain is still there. It's not killing. The painkillers that I may take are not killing my pain. They're just fixing my brain to not recognize it?
Not to be as aware of it and not to be so emotionally engaged with the physical sensations of pain. But another important thing that opioids do, which all substances that humans can become dependent on do, is that they indirectly stimulate the brain reward system, so they make people feel good and give people euphoria. And that initially is why people want to go back and take them over and over in many cases. And then in some cases there are the situations where someone develops pain, gets exposed to opioids, and it does reduce the pain awareness and the pain suffering, and then they want to continue to use them. And then they get into the cycle that Dr. Reese just mentioned, where they need more and more and more to get the effect that they were looking for, and then you have someone who's got opioid use disorder.
Opioids are a class of drugs derived from opium. Heroin is an opiate that was originally sold over the counter from Bayer as a cough suppressant, even for children. This was in the late 1890s through about 1912. The use was strictly controlled for decades in the United States, but things changed as the new millennium arrived.
For many, many years through the last century, the amount of opioids used in shall we say, an addictive fashion was relatively stable. Studies done in the 80s and 90s early 90s showed that there were about 350,000 people dependent on opioids in that addictive manner around the United States. Those were mostly in large cities, and there was mostly heroin, and those were mostly done through injection, through needles. Non-prescribed, heroin bought on the street, illegal, all that kind of thing. What happened in the 90s is through some faulty research and through a lot of problems with the way doctors and pharmaceutical companies work together, we started prescribing opioids for minor pain and for the kinds of things that when I was in training and was Andy was training, they said don't use opiates for that. Only use opiates for acute crash kind of pains or acute injuries kind of pains or terminal life kinds of pains, but don't use them for headaches or bumped knees or sore arms or all those kinds of things. And what happened is, starting in the 90s, the number of people exposed to strong opiates went up by 10 or 20 or 30 times over the next 10 years. So you had a psychoactive substance, opioids. We all have natural opiate receptors in our bodies. Most people in the past, before the 90s, didn't ever get exposed to heavy doses of opiates. And then through the medical profession, pharmaceutical industry, we now had a whole batch of people exposed to high-dose opiates. That's kind of like dragging a sieve through society. Certain people become tolerant and dependent to that feeling and to those receptors in ways that others don't. And those are the people who ended up with opiate use disorders.
According to the New England Journal of Medicine, in the 1980s, less than 1% of patients at Boston University's medical center became addicted to pain medication. But a decade later, doctors were regularly prescribing opioids for pain. Doctors were even taught by Purdue Pharma that OxyContin was time-released and wouldn't cause the euphoria that led to addiction. Was it shoddy work by doctors that resulted in the opioid crisis?
Well, I wouldn't call it shoddy work. I think that physicians were really told that the compassionate, humane thing to do was to treat pain with opioids, and that people would not become dependent or develop a use disorder. And that's what well-intended physicians believed. Yes, there were a few physicians who were running pill mills, and they were just trying to make a lot of money writing these prescriptions, but they were few and far between. So really, I think the whole medical profession was misguided, as Dr. Reese mentioned, when this idea became current that anyone with any kind of pain that went on and on should be given an opioid.
It takes two to tango, too. You know, it was not just the doctors, but the pharmaceutical companies began to market. They could find there's pain, there's money in them, their ills, as some people have said. And so we had this huge amount of prescribing, and people who never used to get exposed got exposed. One of the first patients I ever had in a study that Dr. Saxon hosted in this area, that when we started using buprenorphine, which is an opiate system stabilizer and one of the key medicines in treating opiate addiction, one of the first patients I had, believe it or not, this was a 21-year-old kid who had been an Eagle Scout and had been like the straightest straight arrow kid that you've ever seen in your life. You probably would have hated him when you were in high school because he was so perfect. He was given oxycodone after a major dental procedure and they gave him 30 days supply of oxycodone, which he all took in like 3 or 4 days, because he took it and all of a sudden it was like this magic feeling that he had, this magic feeling of, oh my God, I've never felt, all of a sudden I feel like the real me, you know? And he ate them all in about 3 days, called the doctor up and said, hey, I lost my pills. And you know, this guy had never lied to anybody in his whole life. Got another one, took the whole bottle in about 3 days, and on the 1 week after that, he robbed a pharmacy. Then he robbed 3 more pharmacies, and he came to me through a benevolent, smart judge who said, this is crazy, something's going on here, we need an expert opinion. So that was just a perfect example, and that was like a slap in the face for me, just seeing how dramatic that bad prescribing could expose somebody to something they never would have been exposed before, and how when the opiate receptor takes over, it really takes over. People start doing things they would never do in their life. They start lying, though they've never told a lie before. They start stealing, though they've never stolen before. So it starts steering the ship. No, you're no longer steering the ship.
So the dependency can take place that fast.
It can take that fast.
In popular culture, a drug addict looks like a drug addict. Sunken eyes and cheeks, scars from scratches, thin to the point of something being wrong. So the obvious question, what does an opioid addict look like?
We prefer not to use the term opioid addict because we find that that's stigmatizing, and what we really have, as Dr. Reese just described so eloquently, we have good people who are suffering from a very bad disease. So we prefer to call them people or individuals who have opioid use disorder. And what do they look like? They look like anyone from any strata of society. They look like you and me. There's no way that you're going to pick them out on the street. They're really members of our family, people we know, people we work with.
And let me add to that. I think that the patient, the public's view, the stereotype view of people with addiction is end of the road alcoholic people, the classic kind of view of that Skid Row kind of stuff. And the same thing with opiate addicts. People with opiate use disorders aren't just that. There are still those kinds of folks around, but what's happened since the 90s, there were 350,000 of, quote, those kind of folks back in the early 90s. There's now 3.5 million plus, mostly middle-class white people who have become exposed because they're the ones seeing doctors. They're the ones who had this and that and the other pain. They're the ones who learned, and unfortunately this is true of our society right now, pain means opioids.
Wow.
If I've got pain, I need an opioid. And unfortunately, bad research in the mid-90s through the Purdue Pharma basically created the pain vital sign. And the Joint Commission on Hospital and other regulatory agencies said, you have to document people's pain and respond to that in any medical visit. And so the system got bamboozled, and they helped to spread the issue. Because if you were a doctor and you were seeing somebody and they said, I think I need opioids, I got really bad back pain, and you said, well, I don't think that's good for you. It's not healthy. They'd say, yeah, but I'm in pain and you're withholding that medicine from me. And they're gonna go on your Yelp site and rate you as a bad doctor. So there was a whole lot of forces kind of moving with the medical society to create this monster.
You mean doctors look at Yelp sites and say, I'm not prescribing enough pain medication, so I need to do that so I will have a higher Yelp rating?
Well, it's a sad statement, except for that's just a dramatic example of it. But when you've got people walking out of your office and you have people reporting you to the medical disciplinary board because you didn't assess or treat their pain right, and it says you're supposed to, and opiates equaled pain, that kind of terrible thing went round and round and helped to create this monster.
Well, that's got to be incredibly tough on doctors trying to do the right thing. Do opioids have the same effect on everyone?
No, they don't. That's a very important point. So there are people who are more susceptible to liking opioids based very much on genetics. And we know it's genetics. We have no idea which genes in our 23,000 genome set make people more susceptible. And probably also based somewhat on life experiences. If people have had stressful life experiences, they may be more susceptible. Most people actually don't like opioids. They might take them if they need them in a surgical situation, and they'll say, this makes me feel woozy and dizzy and upsets my stomach, and I want to get off this thing as fast as I can. But then there are the people who are susceptible to them. And it looks like that's about somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people who get exposed to opioids because they're in pain, which is turns out to be a sizable number.
The Human Genome Project is in the early stages of delivering on its great promises. This brings us to the questions of pain and pain management. Is tolerance to pain genetic? Is dependence on drugs genetic? Is the state of our medical knowledge even advanced enough that we should be describing drugs as apocalyptic as opioids?
Well, what we should be doing is, for people who have chronic pain, as Dr. Reese has mentioned, during the 90s and the early 2000s, the reflex response was to give opioids. And what we now know is opioids are not a good treatment for chronic pain, and there are other treatments that should be used primarily. The best treatments for chronic pain are actually forms of psychotherapy that help people, just like opioids do, to get away from focusing on their pain and start focusing on living their life and enjoying life and minimizing the emotional impact of the pain. The problem we have, those types of therapies are not readily available to the average primary care provider or even to the average patient. Insurance isn't necessarily going to pay for that. So we have a healthcare system that's driven to find the cheapest, easiest solution rather than the best solution.
Yeah, let me add to that. I remember when I went to one of the first meetings of the state opioid task force back in the early 90s. I think Andy was probably there too. And they asked neurosurgeons and all these people and back surgeons, what do you need more of? And they all said, what we need more of is CBT, physical therapy, and yoga teachers. That's what they didn't want more opioid. Cognitive behavioral therapy, the kind of psychotherapy that Andy was talking about. Because that's what helps most chronic pain conditions over time. That changes function and improves. And in Washington State, we're very lucky. Gary Franklin, who's head of the State Labor and Industries, did studies some years ago showing that people who had back pain injuries, the sort of standard muscle spasm back pain kind of stuff that half of Americans seem to have, who got opioids in the first week compared to people who didn't, functionally got worse, statistically worse. So it wasn't just that it created dependence or anything else, it was they actually physically got worse. They were less likely to stay active. They were less likely to go back to work. Those kinds of things.
Can you turn on the television and not see an advertisement about a disease you didn't know existed, but you have it? So you need to tell your doctor to prescribe a pill to take care of you. In 2015, over 30% of Americans took 2 or more prescription drugs just in the month of January. It's easier for patients to pop a pill than to make the lifestyle choices we need for better health. Who is the pusher in all of this?
Insurance has helped to drive this too, because if you're a primary care doctor and you're seeing somebody with insurance X or Y or Z, you'll get paid to see that patient and prescribe a medicine, and the medicine will be covered for by the insurance company. But if you prescribe ongoing regular physical therapy visits and a psychologist doing cognitive behavioral therapy, that insurance company either won't cover it or they'll cover 5 visits, something like that. So that you've tied the hands of the doctors, and we're covering the thing that's bad for people, and we're not covering the thing that's been shown in research studies, many, to make them better.
Well, I know this show isn't about the U.S. healthcare system, but it really just kind of brings it into play. Do we just, the makers of our healthcare system, it seems like they just don't care about wellness. They just care about something that they can process on a piece of paper.
I'll answer that one again too. We don't have a healthcare system. We have an unorganized healthcare system, and why many people have pushed for a single payer. Now, we're not communists, we're not socialists, but what we are is doctors, and you won't find many doctors who would say, the way insurance covers things, it creates bad care. The United States uses 90% of all the prescribed opioids in the world.
90%?
90%. Westernized European countries did not have this opiate thing. And so this whole thing with prescribed opioids, getting people dependent who then later move on to heroin, has not happened to much of any degree in European countries, in other countries around the world who have healthcare systems that have some direction that decides to pay for things that are more healthy and not pay for things that aren't so healthy, because there's some sort of central planning of that. In the United States, it's driven by the buck.
60 Minutes, in partnership with the Washington Post, recently did a great piece on the opioid crisis. We have a link up on the screen so that you can learn about the work. One of the things they revealed was the growth of pill mills in the U.S., particularly those dispensing painkiller prescription narcotics like candy. One of those mills was in Mingo County, West Virginia, population 25,000. 11 million pills found its way into Mingo County, all legal. A federal pill mill law allowed this abuse of the public, and the pharmaceuticals took advantage. According to the Washington Post, pharmaceuticals and distributors spent $102 million lobbying Congress from 2014 to 2016 to make sure the pill mills stayed open. Our question for Drs. Saxon and Reese is, did the partnership between Congress and the pharmaceuticals create the deadly epidemic we now face?
Well, I think it's very complicated. And so it's, yes, we do have a system where drug companies can make more money by selling more product. And if you have a product that people have a disorder and they absolutely need to have that product, obviously your sales are going to go up. I think, again, we've already mentioned that the whole medical community became misguided. And then we had the Great Recession, which caused a lot of people to have dislocated lives and a lot of stress. And I already mentioned that if you've had stress in your life, you're more prone to like the opioids and develop problems. But if you're employed and you have a job and you have a place to live, you have less stress than the person who suddenly loses her or his job. And yeah.
Are we just weak? Are we so weak that we have to have some kind of euphoria created by a drug to be able to get through?
I don't think so. I think that we're just like human beings everywhere around the world, and we happen to have this bad set of circumstances occur in our country. And I think it's important now also to talk about some of the ways that we can deal with the problem and get out of the problem.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about treatment.
So when people develop opioid use disorder, we have found, and this is in contrast to people who just have chronic pain where psychotherapy is very good for them. Mm-hmm. We found that people of opioid use disorder, the withdrawal syndrome that they have when they try and come off opioids is so severe, and the effects that opioids have had over time on their brain and their body have changed their brain and body so much that they absolutely need to be on a medication in order to recover from opioid use disorder. And right now, if you have opioid use disorder in the US and you come into treatment, the chances are 3 to 1 that someone's going to tell you what you need is talk therapy and you don't need medication. And we need to turn that around and make sure that everyone with opioid use disorder gets medication as the first line treatment. Now, having talk therapy in addition to that can often be very helpful, but the mainstay of treatment for this disorder is medication. We have 3 FDA-approved medications that all have been tested in the gold standard for determining if a medication works, which is a randomized, controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, which sounds like a lot of jargon, but I can explain that quickly. That means that people don't get to choose their treatment, they get randomly assigned to the treatment. And double-blind means that neither the researchers nor the patients know whether they're getting the active medication or the placebo. And that way you control for expectancies and getting the effects of the medication. And all of these medications perform better than a sugar pill, essentially. And so the 3 medications that we have are methadone, buprenorphine, which Dr. Reese already mentioned, and then naltrexone. And each of those have somewhat different mechanisms of action, so that gives us a pretty good coverage of potential options.
Are they addictive as well?
The term addictive is a little bit of a loaded term.
Yes.
And so There are two physiologic criteria that go into determining a use disorder, which is tolerance and withdrawal. So two of these medications, methadone and buprenorphine, do cause tolerance, meaning that you're going to require to have the opioid, and people do get withdrawal if they come off of them. But they're in many ways very different in their mechanisms of action than some of the opioids that people misuse or that people develop a use disorder on. And then the third medication, naltrexone, is an opioid antagonist. So it goes to the opioid receptor and blocks it, so that if people tried to use opioids, the opioids can't get through the receptor and have any effect. So if someone is concerned about taking a medication that they would have tolerance and withdrawal with, they could use the naltrexone. But the syndrome of addiction goes way beyond physiologic tolerance or withdrawal. It's a whole range of maladaptive behaviors. And we find in most cases, when people get on these medications, even if they have physiologic effects that are like other opioids, the rest of their lives stabilize. So they can go back to work. They their relationships become solid again. They don't have cravings to go out and use these other drugs. They aren't out driving their car while they're intoxicated, that sort of thing. So every other component of what we consider a use disorder can get better even while they're on these medications.
Basically, with heavy use over time of street opioids or heroin or pills, what happens to this subset of people who are genetically set up for this or otherwise fall victim to developing an opiate use disorder is their opiate system becomes damaged. And it becomes damaged in such a way that we don't know actually how to normalize it. It becomes damaged just like people can be born without diabetes, and somewhere along their lives in their teens or 20s, they develop diabetes and their sugar processing system becomes damaged. They then need insulin or other medications to stabilize that sugar management system in order to lead a more normal life. And no matter how you talk to them, that's not going to change. So you need a medication to form the base of treatment. Then behavioral things on top of that can cause better function and more recovery. But without that medication to stabilize the system, they're going to be in trouble. The same is true with opiate people that have developed opiate use disorders.
Be sure to visit the Rainmakers TV website for more from Rainmakers Extra.
Dr. Saxon, Dr. Reese, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for being with us.